Thank you for this opportunity to study more deeply what Jesus meant when he really began to call us higher and say, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." Father, thank you for Dave, and thank you for his love for your word. Thank you for the gift of teaching you've given him, and just bless him as he leads us in this session. Pray our hearts will be open, our minds will be alert. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Dave Monday.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm now muting everybody, so you won't be able to hear from them again.
All right, you all are muted, I guess. Anyway, I'm always kind of, wondering if anybody's really listening, because it's hard to see some of those little faces down here in the display, and some of you are on audio only as well. Anyway, so let's get into it. So Crawford ended a little early. I'm afraid I may have the opposite problem after putting everything together, and so we'll just get right into it. Let me get my mouse on right. Okay, so this section is about kingdom relationships and kingdom marriage. They're also about kingdom righteousness, so it all goes together. And some sections, where the Bibles put their little sections around things, just call this whole section as kingdom relationships and don't even distinguish necessarily the marriage part, because marriage is one of our key relationships as a human being. So it does all fit together in this context. But the lesson does kind of split up in two parts. We talk about our relationships with our brothers and sisters, though, in kingdom times, everything's kind of male dominated, and the new NIV now says he or she every place. Back then they didn't have that kind of sensitivity. So, but then there's a section on our relationships in marriage. So the two parts have some very, very strong similarities in the lessons that we can learn from them. So let's go ahead and read the first section. So you have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not commit murder. Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go, first to be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid the last cent." So you would think, reading Jesus' teachings, that at Jesus' time, the standard of relationships was that if you didn't murder anybody, you were okay. Because that seems to be the only thing that people attributed to having just judgment on. And of course, that was one of the 10 Commandments, along with the others that are in there. But let's start with the word brother. It says if you're, go back and see exactly how it says. It says, if you're angry with your brother. So this word brother, literally, the Greek means from the same womb. We would make sense of that as being a brother. And it, of course, it's masculine. You have to look at the context, though, to really understand the full meaning. So in some places, it means blood brothers, as in Peter and Andrew were blood brothers. And so Matthew 4:18 calls them brothers and uses the same word. In some places, it means religious community. So the Jews, Tom pointed out, the Jews consider themselves all brothers because they were all children of Abraham. Therefore, they literally were all family members. Not many other nations, held on to that closely because the Jews very closely followed their genealogy and recognized themselves as being children of Abraham. But in Galatians 1:2, the same word is used to refer to disciples as brothers, who were obviously not all born of the same mother. They weren't blood brothers. And Jesus, in fact, makes this definition in Matthew 12:46. He says, "Whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother." So Jesus kind of set the standard that people that are followers of the kingdom, followers of God, are going to have this very close family relationship, and can be called brothers and sisters and mothers. And we know that Timothy taught the young man to treat the single women as if they were their sisters in absolute purity, so that this theme kind of goes through the New Testament in many places. So these instructions are in the context of relationships with our fellow believers and not really with the world. I don't think Jesus is trying to use this as a standard as our relationship with the world. We'll cover those relationships a little later when we have instructions about our enemies or things like that. Although Jesus, when he taught the lesson on the Good Samaritan and thing, he definitely taught a different teaching than the Jews were used to about our relationships with those who are not in our direct community, as the Jews would think. And in fact, we are born again of the same womb that is Jesus. So it all fits together. So now let's talk about being angry. I'm sure if I took a raise of hands, which I'm not sure I can do on this, that many of us have been angry before, and so I think this is a word that Jesus pulls in that everyone should relate to. There's not a person that's isolated from the idea of being angry. The word here for anger, though, that implies more of a permanent anger, a decisive anger, not an anger that's a momentary outburst. We all are tend to those, but we also have all been in situations where we've had an anger that lasts, an anger that we can't let go of, where something is really bothering us. It says that if we've got that kind of anger towards someone, that literally, we're guilty before the court. The word translation there literally means liable to judgment, which is the same words he uses about the murder. You're liable to judgment if you commit murder. So that's a standard there. But then he goes on further and raises the bar even further. And it says, if you say to someone, "You good for nothing." And those have been around a while and read the King James Version. The word here is the word raka, which was originally a Aramaic word that was transliterated into Greek and then used in the Bible. But this is the only place in the Bible that it's used, which is kind of interesting. So it was a colloquial term probably in the Aramaic culture. But, you could translate it as empty-headed or numbskull. These are all words that we can relate to. But he's saying that a person who calls someone else a numbskull, an empty-headed person, is then guilty before the Supreme Court, it says in some of the translations. And literally the translation there is liable to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin being the same court, the same rulers that placed the final judgment on Jesus before he was handed over to Pilate. So it's just kind of a step up even beyond just being angry. And then the third one, he says, if anyone calls someone a fool, and the word here is Greek word moros, which is where we get our word moron, or stupid. You rarely call somebody a moron in a technical way. It's always some kind of emotion behind it, some kind of feeling. It is an insult. It's not, in clinical things, you might use it in some psychiatric, thing, talking about someone's mental abilities. But in general, in our culture, and probably it is, that to call someone this would have been a very big insult. You're a moron. And then he says, you're guilty of hell if you do that. So he has ratcheted this up. Literally, it says liable to the hell of fire. So he has progressively taken our, our sensitivities up higher and higher and higher. Because to be honest with you, and I'm guilty of this to the core, is I'm not very convicted about my anger. And Jesus is taking up the notch very high about what a kingdom attitude should be. And we don't think much about calling people names either, when we're angry. And Jesus is making the point that this is much more, a much higher standard than what we would choose for ourselves. So each of these words expresses a stronger and stronger feeling of contempt to someone. You call somebody a numbskull, you're kind of upset with them and everything, but you start calling people fools or morons, your emotional contempt for them has gone up over time, most likely. But in just the way that the emotions, the actions associated with those emotions go up with each stage, Jesus says that the punishment or the consequences goes up as well. You start in a civil court maybe, then you go to the religious court, and then ultimately you're in the heavenly court getting judged for your actions that are coming from your heart. And again, if we go back to the Beatitudes of a pure heart, blessed are those who are pure in heart. Each of these actions is driven by a heart that is less and less pure. And again, though Jesus is talking a lot about actions, if we put in the context, he's talking about and trying to help us. If we talk to somebody and tell them their heart's bad, it's very hard to communicate that. And so you do have to kind of take actions and consequences and situations to try to help somebody see where their heart is, because the heart does drive our actions. Whereas the Pharisees were all focused on the actions, and that if you could get rid of the actions, you could be okay. Jesus is trying to tell us that these actions come from your heart, so that's where you need to fix it. You need to fix it at the heart, not just gloss over the actions. And you know that when you're raising children, if you only focus on behavior, you won't change the heart, and you won't get the behaviors you want, because you'll be playing whack-a-mole all the time, where you're always trying to hit some behavior on the head that are all related to the same heart, until you get the heart to change, before you can really make a significant change. So if we consider the last class, where he's talking about light and salt and our relationships in general, it's very tempting to take these words of Jesus and make them new laws. And this is a temptation we have to all fight. You know, Crawford was talking about sometimes we make our own laws to get legalistic, but we can sometimes look at this and take Jesus as examples where he's trying to talk about a change of heart and turn that into a law. And I've heard people say to me, well, I'm never going to say those two words, you know. So, oh goodness, you called somebody a fool. You're going to go to hell for that. And people latch on that little passage instead of the lesson that what is the heart behind the fact that you called someone that you called someone a moron, or you called someone a good for nothing. That is not a heart that Jesus is wanting. And so I kind of tried to look at that progression, and I said, so if we have inward anger, that inward anger can yield outward irritation, which grows into outright contempt. And I think we can all relate. I can relate tremendously. I know that when I'm getting irritated with people, it's because I'm either got some anger toward them or toward others that's spilling over. And then when I start lashing out with hurtful words, then it's gotten completely out of control. So I think that Jesus is raising the standard to tell us to go all the way back to the very beginning and the source of these behaviors and deal with our anger and recognize that it is something that comes from our heart. So, but just like with the Beatitudes, Jesus doesn't just leave us hanging. He actually gives us solutions to this problem. Sometimes, again, we take the scriptures, and particularly I think a lot in the Sermon on the Mount, we want to divide it up into little bitty chunks and make it something. But these are all tied together. And so Jesus is using these next couple examples as the solution to the anger problem, the solution to the heart problem. So the two examples are, one is that you know that someone has something against you, okay? And you may have found out through a third party. You may have felt a coldness from them in fellowship or something, but you realize, you know, I've hurt, or you just know that you did something that could have hurt them, and you want to deal with that. So, you know that someone has something against you. The implication to me here, it implies that it's a private situation. It's just between you two. You know, not everybody knows about this, unless maybe somebody third party told you. And then the second example that he uses is says, you have a disagreement with someone to the point that you're going to court. All right, so that implies a public situation. We got third parties involved. There've been you've been pulled into court to deal with this disagreement, for lack of a better word. So those are our two examples. So let's move kind of through some of those and see how that works. So the thing that we need to see is the solution to both examples is, again, the same solution. The solution is to be reconciled. So let's look at that. The church family should have a goal of always being in a state of reconciliation. I mean, I got points down the road here, but we just need to be reconciled. If the church can't be reconciled with each other, who can? So in order to do this, though, we have to be urgent to settle matters quickly. And that is the underlying lesson here, to be urgent and to do it quickly. So both examples show urgency and quickness. So you think about the guy that's sitting here at the altar. He's about to give his gift, and he realizes that somebody is upset with him. Now, in the book that Tom and Steve wrote, they make this long thing about how much trouble it was to go make a sacrifice at the temple. You know, in our minds, we think, oh, I'm walking by, oh, I need to make a sacrifice, and you just kind of pull in, deal with it, and then go home. But really, it was probably at least a half a day effort. You know, by the time you got the sacrifice, get it blessed by the priest and approved as not being blemished or anything, and then stand in line to get to the altar. You could have gotten to that point, and when it came to your mind that you needed to deal with something, in our minds, we would say, oh, wow, I really need to deal with that. I'll do it tomorrow. And in Jesus' way that he uses hyperbole in all of these lessons, the urgency he wants us to have is that, wow, I need to drop this altar right now and go deal with my situation. Which means that if he then wanted to go sacrifice, he would have had to come back and go through the whole half-day routine to get back in line and get back to do his gift. And so there is a very distinct feeling of urgency, a cost of time, quickly, you know, a time urgency as well as a heart urgency to deal with it. So then he's got this guy that's taking him to court, and on this one he says, man, meet the guy on the road before you even get to the judge. You do not need to wait until you get to court. You don't need to wait until you get to the judge. You know, and so maybe you find, you know, somebody is upset with you and somebody else has gotten involved and you're going to have a meeting of the three of us. He would say, man, if at all possible, you need to go deal with this even before you get to the judge, even before you get to the venue. So again, this spirit of urgency of dealing with it quickly. And that lesson is the same in both examples. Whenever you see a couple examples with the same root solution, then you can kind of surmise that the point is the solution, not the examples. The point is to be urgent and quick about these things. So another key principle that I see in both of these is that the reconciliation starts with a one-on-one conversation. You know, we're often much too quick to talk to others, to complain, to get advice, et cetera, when we have these situations come up. And even within this one, we can't separate it. You know, you hear somebody's against you or somebody's taking you to court, clearly means somebody's got something against you. So we've got everything covered here, but the very first step is one-on-one conversation. Matthew 18, we use this teaching for conflict resolution a lot. It's got a lot of parallels to this passage. We'll see even more in just a minute, but it starts with a one-on-one conversation. And I know for me personally, as an elder, as people come to me and start to tell me about a situation they think that I should get involved in, my first question has become, have you talked to them directly? And most of the time the answer is no. And so I don't even let them tell me who it is until after they have fulfilled this first step of reconciliation and go to the person and talk to them. Make an effort to make the resolution individually and in private. Now, the practicals of that are if you tell me about something and then you go talk to them about it, it's not very often that you're going to come back and tell me it's reconciled. because now it's over in your mind, and you're not going to go back and tell everybody you told about the situation that it's all better. And so everybody you talk to is now left with an impression of a problem that probably may not even have been real, may have been just a simple misunderstanding. It may have been a lot of different things, but you create in the body of brothers and sisters some of these things that just aren't true. And then they become points of judgment down the road. So in both situations, one-on-one, even meeting the accuser on the road before you even get to the judge has that same, I think the same teaching, the same principle that Jesus is trying to get. So, we've often heard that Matthew 5 is about when somebody's got something against you. Matthew 18 is when you have something against somebody else. But the basic principles taught in both of these examples, as well as the instructions in Matthew 18, are the same. Deal with things quickly and urgently. Deal with things directly with the individual involved first. And that not dealing with these things will hinder our relationship with God and could bring judgment on us. And so he really is bringing home the level of urgency of maintaining good relationships with our brothers and pure relationships. All right, let's take a little break, and I guess, can I unmute, I think? Let me try. I'm newbie here. That's not what I want to do. Let's try. Not everybody else. Maybe you can do it, Crawford, so people can ask a question. I think you're the host now.
Okay. I'm hitting unmute all.
All right. I hear you now. Anybody have any questions, comments before we move to the second half?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll make a comment. I know even when there appears to be a really tough situation, I mean, the one-to-one, for me, the first thing comes to mind is, okay, let me talk to that brother right away or whatever. But then it's like when it's something real, real deep, there's always the tendency to want to say, well, let me get some advice beforehand so I can be sensitive in approaching them to make sure that, I handle it correctly or whatever. But I appreciate you saying, one-to-one, one-on-one first. It may alleviate a bunch of stuff, and until you've gone through that process, you don't really know. And interesting enough, I was thinking about how, I'm an administrator at a high school, and a lot of times parents will call in and say, I have this issue with this teacher. My kid said this, that, and the other, and the first question I have is, have you talked with the teacher? Because you heard the kid's side, but there's always two sides to a story. Have you talked to the teacher to give them the opportunity to explain what they're seeing or what has happened? And no matter what the situation may be, now, all the way up from an easy one all the way to a hard one, that's going to be a question. And so I think, this kind of brings light at how it applies to this as well. It's a similar situation just from a job for me to be able to relate. But I like, no matter what it is, no matter how difficult it may be, one-on-one, first and foremost, it may resolve it. Who knows? You don't know. You may be thinking more into it than what needs to be there, but deal with that and then take it from there to follow, what the scripture says.
Yeah, I had a situation where a younger brother came to me, and he had become aware of a situation that involved, a person much older than him in the church, and he was intimidated. He didn't think he could talk to him or whatever, and I just said, don't tell me who it is. you need to go talk to them first. And it worked out great. You know, there was sin, there was things, and the older brother involved, you know, called me to talk about it and stuff. But again, the process was much. I think it's in line with what Jesus really wants us to do. I think he's very, very clear in both of these passages here and in Matthew 18 about the way the process should go. Anybody else? All right. We'll move right on then. Let's see, get back here. All right. So our next section is classically called the section on marriage and divorce. Many people go to this passage to get specific instructions about marriage and divorce. And there are some in here, but in the context here, it's really talking about, again, kingdom relationships and kingdom righteousness, and how that gets applied to some of our most intimate relationships, to say, is our marriages. So let's jump into this. So reading the whole thing, it says, "You've heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery." And just make a note, I've copied these from the New American Standard, and if you're ever reading the New American Standard, its typeface standard is that whenever there is something that is a direct quote from the Old Testament, it's always used as that all caps font. So it's just it's kind of like words in red being Jesus's words in a lot of Bibles. In the New American Standard, anything that's in all caps like that is a direct quote from the Old Testament. So that's just a note that might help you if you're reading through the New American Standard. So you've heard that it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, tear it out, throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. All right, so let's go ahead. So Jesus' focus is on the responsibility of the man when he's telling this, but he's talking to a male-dominated society. We're going to keep the context of the audience. In this society, you know, women had little to say in how things were done. I don't think there's any indication that I've seen that women could give certificates of divorce to men. It was always the man who was in control. It was the men who made decisions. It was the men who had the responsibility in things. But again, this focus of this lesson is on the condition of the heart, not necessarily on the specifics. So we have to be very careful not to turn this teaching into a specific legalistic interpretation of marriage, because that's not what Jesus' intentions was. You can't read all that Crawford talked about and all the Beatitudes and everything that's been set up to here and say that Jesus was trying to set up a new law and trying to take the old law and refine it and correct it and all that. That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to take it higher and make it come from our hearts. So we have to keep that context in as we read these things. So in the law, the standard was the actions of adultery, which would be a married man sleeping with another woman or a woman sleeping with another man's wife. or a man sleeping with another man's wife, or the woman that is involved. We know in John chapter 8, I believe it is, it has the woman caught in adultery. It says caught in the act of adultery. So I always wondered, they grabbed the woman and put her out on the street and stoned her, but where was the man? Because you can't have an act of adultery without a man with you. So I've always wondered what happened with that. But again, the adultery, when the word is used, it's very specific definition about the acts. But Jesus introduces a new standard, the standard of lust. So what is lust? Lust is a strong desire to have something. It's very similar to covet, which is one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet, your neighbor's possessions. And covetousness is the heart root that yields to stealing. Because if you want somebody else's stuff, then the next step is to go take it. And lust is the very same kind of parallel there with that. But we don't use the word covet very much in our day-to-day operations. Sometimes I joke and say, I would really covet having that car, but it's kind of as a joke, not serious in the same way. But lust, the root of it is it's our desires. Jesus' standard of the heart is that if you look at a woman with a heart of desire, then you're same as someone who commits the act. So just looking and noticing beauty is not lust. It becomes lust when you put desire behind it. And I think we do have to be careful that we don't paint everybody in a corner and say, we have to walk around with blinders and you can't ever see, attractive women. But it's when the desire goes behind that, and we all know when those thoughts are in there, when those hearts come up. But that's what we're talking about. And remember, we're talking about in a society where women were not dressing the way they do now. And so it's not necessarily just a function of being able to see more and more skin or more body parts. The heart is the desire to have, to be with. And so a man in Jesus' time could desire a woman even if she was wearing a full burqa, I'm assuming. It doesn't really matter. The heart is the same. So, when we have purity ministry in our churches where brothers and sisters get together to try to get help to deal with these desires, these urges that are, and to try to remain pure. It's the right word, to be pure. The problem is sometimes when we say to someone, how is your purity? Then all we're doing is asking them about their actions. When really we ought to be asking, how is your heart? How are you dealing with your contentment with your current situation? How are you having a heart that doesn't push you to the point of the actions that the ministry is trying to help with? So again, we got to take things back to the heart at all times. So the question is, are we caring for someone as a person, not lusting after them as an object? And that's where these things come with pornography and all the other forms of impurity that we talk about. It's when a person is being changed into an object to satisfy carnal desires, where there is not any, there's not affection, there's not a heart that's pure before God. And so we got to deal with our heart of being content and recognizing that these things are reserved for a relationship of intimacy between a husband and a wife. So, but we also have to be careful that we don't get legalistic again in the other way. Say, Jesus is not saying that lusting after a woman when you're married then gives your wife legal grounds for divorce. You know, if you start trying to parse these things, and this is what the rabbis of the day, and Crawford led to the Talmud, which was their effort to take all of these teachings that you had and put specifics on every single one, every circumstance. And you could easily come in here and say, okay, Jesus said that lust is the same as adultery, so therefore you have been committed adultery and I am free from my marriage vows because you have broken them. And I've actually had somebody make that argument with me when it came to a husband that was committing pornography. And the pornography is a sin, and it's a sin of the heart, but I don't think we can legalistically take this passage and use it as legal grounds for divorce. Again, I'm saying this over and over and over again because I think it's so important that we read these things and get the context of the heart and the basic teaching Jesus is having, and not try to peel out individual things that we would like to use in some way. So we got to dig deeper. So that's when you're studying your Bible, you know, you can't just pull that one verse out and say, see, it says this. You have to get into what's the overall lesson that's being taught either by the whole letter by Paul or the whole paragraph or whatever it may be. So Jesus' focus here, I believe, is to raise the bar of kingdom righteousness beyond the legalistic view. And remember that when the Beatitude said the pure in heart will see God, we talked about the fact that seeing God was a very dangerous thing because you'd be struck down dead if you saw God. And so having a pure, unstained, unblemished heart seems to us to be an impossible thing. And yet Jesus says, with God, all things are possible. So we can get there. All right. So it seems like when you read this passage that there's this other section, there's these two verses that, you know, our first reaction as we read them, that they're kind of stuck in the middle and that they have nothing to do with divorce and adultery. But if you take that view, then you're saying that Jesus really didn't know what he was saying and that he just kind of lost his mind a little bit when he stuck them in here. And we can't do that. So we have to really look at it and say, okay, how do they relate? What is the point? They have to be connected to have been said in the same breath as Jesus did here. Jesus never taught random thoughts, you know. He was a man who's very deliberate in his teaching and the situations that he was doing. So the word here that's translated stumble, you know, if your eye causes you to stumble, or if your I've drawn a blank. Your eye and your hand. Matthew 18 says the foot gets in there too. So the word translated stumble is used a lot in the New Testament. It could mean offend, and it is used that way a lot of times where it says what Jesus did offended the Pharisees. And you could easily say that Jesus caused the Pharisees to stumble over their pews. They were not at peace because of what he said. But it also means to cause to stumble or to fall away. The root word means to trigger a trap. This word is used in the passage that talks about not causing one of the little ones to stumble, or by our sin pulling others into it. And the root Greek word is actually the word scandal, that we get the English word scandal from, which is when someone is caught in a sin that they've been trying to keep a secret, and it causes a scandal, right, usually. We hear a lot about those these days. That's all the news is. It's all the political environment is today is scandal. It's one scandal after another. That's all it is. So often our sins come from getting caught in a trap that if we had thought ahead, if we could have avoided. You know, there are situations we put ourselves in thinking we're stronger than we are, or we turn things on TV that we know we shouldn't, and we set ourselves up with these traps. So that's what this root word is kind of talking about. Matthew 18 has a parallel. Remember, we saw Matthew 18 had the passage about reconciling and go to your brother and then bring up 2 or 3 parties together to do it. It's parallel with Matthew 5, talking about the resolutions, the reconciliation. But in Matthew 18, he also talks about if your eye causes you to sin, your foot, your hand, and he has the exact same passage. So Matthew must have thought that these ideas were important enough to put in the gospel twice, emphasizing these things of Jesus. But what we got to get out of this is that Jesus is using a technique called hyperbole to emphasize how serious the condition of our heart is, and that our actions come out of our hearts and relate to our salvation. We are very big at minimizing our sin. It's just very natural because we don't like to feel guilty. We don't like to feel inadequate. And so we just go through all kinds of things to try to make ourselves seem better, and we minimize the situations. We want to seem like we're strong, so we put ourselves in situations we don't need to be. So hyperbole means Jesus is exaggerating. It's obvious that he doesn't want us to pluck out our eye or cut off our hand. You know, Tom made the point and says, why did he pick on the right eye? He could have just as easily said the left eye, or said any eye. So it's obviously not a literal thing, you know. And again, we know that in the early centuries, there were religious sects that took these passages and went down this and started to create masochistic environments where they would literally cut themselves and do all kinds of things in response as to try to purge sin from their lives, and that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's merely trying to get across the point of how important and urgent these things are. So after he has these 2 little interludes here about how important it is, he jumps right into divorce. And he uses this as another example of our hearts regarding relationship. In the old law, a man could divorce his wife for just about any reason. In the book that Tom and Steve wrote, it quotes several rabbis that were peers of the time, and they're taking the Leviticus passage that is used here and basically interpreting to mean anything. You know, if she just doesn't look good enough for you or whatever, you just divorce her. And so that's the environment, and that was what was pretty much taught at Jesus' time. So let's jump again to Matthew 19. You see Matthew 18 and 19 kind of parallels for this section in Matthew 5. So let's read what Jesus said about that again, just again to know where he's coming from. So some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? You know, that's what every man wanted to hear. And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. Again, all caps, because this is a quote back from the very beginning of Genesis when he created the marriage between Adam and Eve. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. What God has joined together, let no man separate. And we've all heard that at the end of a marriage ceremony many, many, many times. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And this always amazes me, how the disciples are so clueless half the time when Jesus is teaching and they reveal what's going on. He says, the disciples said to him, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, is it better not to marry? Yeah, it was so overwhelming for them to think that you could never get out of a marriage, that you should never get married in the first place. It's just amazing to me that they reveal this and stuff. So it's just a little side note. I throw that verse in just to show the state of the disciples. But that's the state of all men that Jesus is speaking to at the time. Wow, I need to have a way out, and Jesus is closing the door. So if we're not careful, again, we're going to latch onto these things as legal reasons to divorce and miss the heart Jesus is telling about. Jesus said the only reason there was a liberal divorce law was because of the hardness of hearts. So we're back again to the heart. The heart, the heart, the heart, the heart. Everything is about the heart. So we know God's heart about this from Malachi 2:15, where he says, take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth. For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. That's God's heart. You know, if we want to know what about heart, that's God's heart about divorce. So everything we do when we teach about divorce, when we counsel about divorce, this is the context. God hates it. And Jesus is saying basically that he hates it too. All right. So because a single woman were probably vulnerable economically, a divorced woman would possibly be on the street, destitute, maybe move back in with their parents. You know, they didn't have the same economic opportunities as a man. They didn't get inheritance from their parents. They didn't have property, all these kind of things. So in the context of the focus of the lesson on heart, of a man giving a divorce certificate, says the man is cold and had no concern for the well-being of the woman. They didn't. We don't see that they had divorce courts like we do that split property and do all those kinds of things. Back then, the guy kept it all, and the woman just went out on the street with what was on her back. And the underlying thing I think here is he was not willing to reconcile, which ties us all the way back to our first section where it says, in all broken relationships, the importance is working on reconciliation. There is no way as human beings that we can interact with each other and not have conflict and not have these situations where somebody is upset with us or we're upset with somebody else, that we don't have initial feelings of anger. And in the marriage relationship that comes up, it's even more. You're in closer quarters. Your hearts are vulnerable. You're easier to offend because you've let your guard down when you're in a marriage situation. And I've not run into people that are struggling more with bitterness than people that are in marriage problems, because it just drives, because we're so vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable and you get hurt, you strike back very strongly. And so the underlying lesson here is the concern for the woman and the willingness to be reconciled. So, are we doing on time? Right? We're not doing too bad. So what's the main lesson of this whole section on the Sermon on the Mount? You know, I'm a big believer in tying everything together to the theme or however it's doing. So what I get out of this is that the importance of having a right relationship and the heart that is urgent for reconciliation. Important to have righteous relationships and the heart that is urgent for reconciliation. It would be unrealistic to think that we're never going to need reconciliation with each other, because we are going to hurt each other. I have more hurt feelings in the church than I have in the world. I get hurt by people more easily, and I hurt others. It happens more in the church. Why? Again, because we're closer. We have higher expectations. We expect people to treat us better. We just have a lot of things going on there. So these things come up more and more. I don't have that many people in the world that I feel I need to reconcile with, and a lot of times we don't, though. We just walk away. But the heart that Jesus is trying to get us is importance of being right in our relationships and the urgency of dealing with that through reconciliation. How can we be peacemakers? Back to the beatitude of be peacemakers. How can we be the peacemakers that bring reconciliation to the world if we can't be reconciled with our brothers or our spouses? This, to me, is the true heart of the kingdom life, is having reconciled relationships. And Jesus is just making the case through examples and specific prescriptions to get us to see that. And that's it. So unmute, get some comments, questions about the whole thing or all of it together, pieces.
Good lesson, Dave. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Jack. Certainly stirs me to be more urgent. I know that here in Nashville we've had some conflict. The elders and the evangelists have had to work through things over the last year. And looking back and taking this lesson, there's definitely things that I think I and we could have and should have done differently, particularly in the being more urgent on the one-on-one situation to deal with it more quickly. I think we have been urgent in trying to get help and really working through things, and we're enjoying some the fruit of really things going much better as a result of that. But still, you can look at this lesson and see that urgency at the beginning is where the importance is. Well, if there are no other questions or whatever, we're done a little bit early. Hello? Yes?
Hi. This is Colleen. I really enjoy this class very much, and Crawford too. Thank you guys. Wow. I wanted to comment after the first half, but I'm not in such a situation at the moment, so I might have to talk to y'all later. But wow, really, really great. I can't even be specific right now. I'm just like, wow. But I guess the screen that's up there right now, how can we be peacemakers that bring reconciliation to the world if we cannot be reconciled with our brothers or our spouses? That's something, I've been feeling for way too long. So your comment you just made, I really relate to that too. Like I lived overseas, I was on a mission field, I was, focused on reconciling people. But now it's like I need to deal with my own so that I can, it always hurt my heart so much that the lack of reconciliation holds other people from their reconciliation with God, because it's like, what a waste of time, what a waste of time whenever, it's not dealt with quickly, it's affecting other people's salvation in a way, God will help people be saved if it's not through me, through someone else. But, kind of what Crawford referenced, that we're part of the healing, that we can be part of the healing, but we need to be reconciled first.
Yeah, and the marriage thing, I think Jesus chooses this, and you can see by the reaction by the apostles is, wow, we shouldn't get married then, because it is a difficult, sometimes can be a difficult relationship to get reconciled. But Jesus doesn't hold back in saying how important it is. And then the teachings on marriage that Paul talks about in Corinthians, where he's trying to give specifics, and that's a whole nother lesson. But he does talk about situations that are hard, and they are emotions that do create barriers. But our heart should have the heart that wants to reconcile quickly. Even if there are barriers to getting there, we should have that desire.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I was thinking back. Well, first of all, it's beautiful how all this comes together. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, even everything afterwards, and then permeating it all is what's happening at the heart level. And I think back to, and even the position of it, how he started out this ministry with this, but then, I think back to how, back in the 80s, 90s, of how, the focus was Matthew 28:18-20, go make disciples of all nations. Let's make disciples of the whole world in our generation, in our lifetime. And then all the things that led up to the creed letter, and looking back at how if we had focused on this instead of Matthew 28-20, that would have accomplished that, but then we would have, all that stuff would have been dealt with along the way, that, all that stuff would have been reconciled prior to getting to that point. And it's all at the heart level, and how all this came together, and Jesus just, in his genius of wisdom, can pull all this together and tie it all up with the bow of it's all at the heart level, dealing with it at the heart level. So, I appreciate even having an opportunity to listen in on this lesson and hear all this, because it's like the young lady said, it's, on one hand, overwhelming that you almost feel like you don't know where to start and sharing what you're feeling, because it's a lot. But then at the same time, it's so simple that it's like you're experiencing a miracle, if you will, or that light bulb going off. Like, man, this is powerful stuff. So simple yet so complex, but all tied up together.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think we can learn that the dealing with it quickly, the progression of anger, and then the anger goes up higher, we're name calling, and then we become really angry. When it gets to the third step, it's much harder to reconcile than if we start quickly and at the beginning. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to get us to do, is deal with it. So in our marriages, we just don't have discipling in our marriages like we used to have, and we don't really have honest talks. And we let things build up, and by the time, I as an elder get involved in somebody's marriage, man, they're like 3 years down the road when they should have been talking 3 years ago. And it is very difficult to deal with the hurts that have built up over a severe amount of time. So dealing with things quickly and urgently when you first have twinges of anger is what we need to do. All right. Well, I thank everybody for coming. Crawford's going to close it out. Let's close out with a prayer. I feel a need to pray because this is challenging to all of us. God, you are a God of reconciliation. You made extreme efforts to reconcile us to you, allowing your Son to be taken from you in heaven and tortured and killed and abused. And so the things that we should do is equally be urgent in the reconciliation with each other as brothers, and then be able to share that reconciliation that you have with the whole world. Just help our hearts to be soft and open to these ideas, and pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.